Hello everyone, today we talk about the Franks and the development of the Pippinid-Carolingian military clienteles. We made already some video about both the Merovingian and Carolingian power base. Perhaps we could go, and as we are in fact a bit more in depth, and we will surely make something ever more detailed on these topics. Especially, we already made a video about the Frankish commendatio at the root of the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, and we haven't really emphasized enough, I would say, the bond existing really, and the continuity between the Merovingian and the Carolingian world. Especially, we have to talk a lot about the first, right? At least about the latter we made more videos, but the Merovingians are definitely overlooked. We made a playlist recently. I see that these are some of the most watched videos, probably not because they're much different from the ones I make, but because there's not much Merovingian stuff around. So today's video is trying to bridge the two sides, because from one side we have to explain what how the Carolingians came to power in a systemic sense, and we have already seen it, right? But especially considering how the preconditions for it were already present, for better and for worse, from a Frankish perspective. As you know, the Merovingian times were somewhat critical, aside from the major expansion at the beginning. For, in fact, delving the same Carolingian power, reuniting what was the Frankish Empire rather than a kingdom. As you know, the Franks were extended, first of all, on a quite large territory on its own, especially longitudinally speaking, between Neustria and Austrasia, that were quite different lands if you pick the extremes. And yet they governed also on a multitude of peoples in the south, fundamentally. We're talking about the Aquitanians, the Burgundians, the Alemanni, the Bavarians, etc., and eventually the Carolingian Empire would expand, the Thuringians. The Carolingian Empire would expand further. We've seen how this, the consolidation of Merovingian power had occurred. It might have not happened, right, easily if, I don't know, Clovis had been killed at Tolbiac, or, various contingencies that could happen. We would have had something different. But probably the political and social articulation, especially of the Roman Gaul, would have brought to the development of something, in fact, similar to what we know as the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system. And this last connection is crucial, because really what we see as eventually developing as a feudal society at the extreme of it in the High Middle Ages is, and stemming from the Frankish Carolingian world, was not really like, in many ways, yes, it was kind of a Frankish brand at the time, right? But it wasn't by form, rather by substance, meaning that the form had already existed in fact, clientery relations among any people. This was true for the early Germans, it was true for the Romans, it was even true for the Celts, for the Gauls. It was just how pre-industrial societies worked, with some leaders, chieftains, and a retinue, a following, and some people essentially dwelling under such signory. What happened in Gaul, we have explained it many times, and broadly speaking, in the Frankish era, but not only. As we will see now, this was true at different degrees in many other, basically in all peoples in Europe. Just it's the degree of difference that varies, but it was really in the same way. The Germanic society, Romano-Germanic society, especially, that this is quite evident, right? At least for how it intertwined with the post-Roman world, right? It was true also among the Slavs, even though they didn't have the connection. But in fact, their process of hierarchization would take much longer time. This is the same is true also for the Scandinavians, right? So the idea is that Gaul, as Spain, that eventually was taken over by the Muslims, so that was kind of a different story, but up to that point it was not so different. had not had, this is crucial, especially Wickham wrote lots of beautiful works on this, had not had their estates, their destroyed from Roman times. Right? Gaul, yes, had suffered lots of devastations, etc., but this does not compare with, I don't know, with the real, could say, literally a revolution that happened in the Romano-Brittonic world, that also predates actually the Anglo-Saxon invasions, and in the same Italy that was ravaged by the Gothic war that effectively destroyed the big estates, and especially this is evident with the with the Longobards that continued, in fact, on the wake of this more Germanic model, kind of small, medium-sized land property, right? And Gaul therefore remains this enormous land, even as we know, extensionally speaking, this enormous Atlantic plains, fertile with a fat soil, especially in those areas that, not surprisingly, would be the core land, also from a political and military point of view, as it was of the Merovingians, of the Carolingians, but also of the Capetians, right, and of French power in general. So more actually shifted towards the Gala Roman reality, rather than the Austrian one, rather than the Austrasian one. It was kind of more Germanic in nature, but more of that too, because we have to explain how the Carolingians, also that came from Austrasia, managed to take over the Neustrium, right? And as a consequence, when the Franks settled in this world, mostly as political military rulers, right? But they fundamentally established themselves as landlords and marrying into the Gallo-Roman aristocracy that was already embodied essentially by what were the descendants of the senatorial order, the bishops, that also had families, children, etc., on their own. And so great part, actually, what we see as the most ancient nobility in Europe actually stemmed from these realities. I mean, a name among others, we actually miss one ring in the chain, but, for example, the Habsburgs, we are pretty much sure that they originally descended from the Romano-Burgundian aristocracy that eventually was involved in other more international mechanisms, because there was also great mobility. I mean, this Frankish Empire, as a matter of fact, was a great blender, was a pretty extent thing that, as you understand, worked as all powers of the time, also by cooptation, by decentralization. In fact, there's a big vassalatic clientele, right? By letting, in part, at that point, the local aristocracies marrying to the Frankish ones ruling the land, also with a continuity in their pre-existing ethnic rule in terms of the law of the land, for example, or in fact, properly the same Frankish law contemplated as a different national identity than the Frankish one, right? Properly in the term of the Latin natio, that is different from the modern nation, but it's still exemplificative of fact of the existence of different pools of different stocks of different communities that had historically had kind of a different past, but also the word blending, especially at the top, especially among the elites. And so, as we know, great part of what we call, think the expression as Charlemagne, the father of Europe, right, and things like these. Well, this is something, of course, dates back to a long time before. I mean, what about the Indo-European migrations? What about part of the Roman Empire? What about the same Merovingians, right? There was a constant blending and, commonality in these areas that, in fact, also owed much in their power with the pre-existing one. I mean, the Franks had settled in Gaul because it was Roman Gaul, because it was a well-administered, fertile, populated, advanced land, right? And it was factually the richest land in Europe in absolute terms, properly in amount of wealth, by early medieval times. So it was very appealing for these chieftains arriving from Germany, gradually, serving essentially in the Roman army and having as federati ever more land and fief, but essentially by the same Romans, the same practices in many ways. And I insist there also on infrastructural continuity. You can't really see the Frankish power in what was essentially the Gallia Belgica if you don't realize that largely all the estates that the Romans had established close to the Rhine frontier, what they had for centuries stationed there the largest force, the largest amount of legions in the empire, actually were in fact taken over by the Frankish nobility that began to rule them, and rule even sometimes at the very beginning, especially some literal Roman units that were still there. This is especially evident in early Merovingian times. I made a video about, not specifically about this, they have still to do it, I mean the continuity of the Roman military under Frankish rule, also properly by community, right? Meaning that those people were recognized as descendants of the legionaries, that had a certain status, they were part of the military colonies, also the Merovingian freemen, but properly in the organizational form of the Merovingian army at the time, also logistically, even in military engineering, artillery, things like these. And again, I hope to go in detail soon about this stuff too. And so what you see, as always, is also, as you know, Germanic migrations were not really that dramatically impacting from a demographic point of view. The Roman lands were overpopulated, and these invaders were often just at most like some points percentage of the entire population. But of course, they came to rule because they were fully integrated in the system, in the hierarchy, and that's why the Merovingian history is not an easy history. As we'll see now, it was much easier. We've seen it in the playlist about the Longobards, to rule a country like Italy, where the aristocracy, the old senatorial aristocracy, had been beheaded during the Gothic War, and so kind of the only functional elective monarchy, still with the idea of the people in arms, that would actually agree on electing a monarch. It would even be a functional one, because there was fundamentally no aristocracy competing with him could operate. Other lands such as Visigothic Spain or the same Merovingian Gaul were a freaking mess, because there were already feudal realities where the monarchy factually didn't have really a control on it, which was worsened, especially this is the case of the Merovingians, by the establishment of a real dynastic rule. As I often stress, the Franks didn't have the most remote or minimal glimpse of what public authority meant. Their rule was private. And the Merovingians, differently from... Why are we talking about a dynasty, not a people, right? We don't say the Franks anymore, like we could say the Visigoths, or the Anglo-Saxons, or the Alemanni, or whatever. We're talking about the Merovingians. We're talking about a single family. Because Clovis had literally beheaded basically all the rest of the Frankish nobility so that he could become the sole true monarch of the land. And with an overwhelming support, of course, of the Gala Roman clergy, that were the most powerful landlords left after the evaporation of Roman rule in the land, and in fact establishing this ferocious alliance between the Frankish warlikeness and bloodthirstiness, thirst in the best Germanic tradition, with the passion of Christ, with hematophilia, with the insistence not just on blood spilling as warriors of their own blood, of other people's blood, the sworn oaths of brotherhood were essentially a devotion of the entire soul, of the entire existence, like another, literally, a ritual death and rebirth into the military war bands that was done by drinking each other's blood, like in the in the last stages of the Nibelungen resistance in Attila's palace, when they start drinking their own blood. The Middle Ages and kind of chivalric literature embellished that a little bit, but it's actually a reminiscence of these kind of odes. But properly, the idea that rule existed within the Merovingian blood, which was actually revolutionary from a German perspective, because as you know, the Germans traditionally and other peoples are a bit more like that, didn't like monarchy at all, right? There was an idea of kind of a sort of egalitarian idea, which was still essentially the oligarchy ruling in a mob-like fashion and claiming equality, on that ground, so that nobody would prevail over the others, so they could essentially take care of their own business without control. And this was kind of the natural state of the thing in the Barbaricum in Central Europe, where there weren't enough resources to centralize, whereas as the Merovingians, Clovis actually settled in Gaul, he carried out this systematic elimination of all this, Frankish sub-kings, because effectively they were all called so properly Regis, which in Latin also, as they were, because they took the name from the Roman titles, from the alliance, etc. It doesn't mean the king. It means just there are several kings, right? It was just the term rex in Latin, stems from essentially from the same background and mentality in Roman ideal. The idea is that the leader is sacred, right? That the imperium lays within the chieftain. So this feudal mob lord that has the faculty of power, because being given through his own virtue by God, right? And so that has the faculty to rule and to wage war and to command, right? Because he's better than the others. And there was actually a racialistic bias to it, literally, as the Romans did, but also this Germanic rulers believed that superiority came also in an ethnic sense, that the individual was stronger and capable of ruling, but was literally coming with a better blood, right? And better, and it was an origin was considered to be divine. That again, in a world where the majority of freemen could take up arms and kind of even oblige, as we've seen it, for example, the Battle of Strasbourg, literally the nobility to dismount. That was the kind of, were the Alemanni, but basically the Franks were the same thing. Because they didn't want them to run away to become more powerful, to capitalize out of the eventual massacre of the freemen on the field, so that at home could be more powerful. But that middle class had such a great power, and it lived on, especially in countries like Italy, like Britain, where the Longobards, the Anglo-Saxons, respectively, were kind of less stratified, as we've seen before. In countries like Gaul, it was hierarchy, pure, something enormous, right? That conferred, in fact, the enormous power that the Merovingians had, because they thought that at that point, the entire land was Clovis' possession. I mean, the idea was that the Imperium had, I made a video about this Clovis, the rise of Clovis from Germany to empire, something like that the Imperium had conferred Clovis the faculty of ruling over the entire land. What the Franks had conquered because of under his leadership, and therefore what actually all the land was the private possession of Clovis and his dynasty. And the Merovingians operated a radical ideological fabrication of this idea that, again, what was fundamentally strange to the Franks, or at least it was mythologically. There were this idea, that also according to the story, Clovis should have been by like 1/4 a maritime monster, right? All these connections with the sea, it's a complicated thing in the Indo-European mythology. We'll talk about that. It's not just like an anecdote. It was something deeply important that already among, the Germanic chieftains was, attempted by claiming some sort of superiority, when this was already boasted in the form properly of being the rulers of the land, where the freemen were kind of already weakening at this point. Well, Clovis extended it to the whole freaking Frankish kingdom. That is to say, and this lived on in Romano-Germanic Europe as a juridical tradition. Every single freaking piece of land that it had these people had conquered and ruled on was essentially a private possession of the ruling dynasty, because they were considered to be they were divine, right? They were considered property of a superior, of another race, of another kind, right, of beings that were superior to all others and owned their power entirely on the rest of the community. And this is at the root of much of, you would think, in the land also, of the enormity from a moral point of view, also what not just the Merovingians achieved as the greatest power in Western Europe, but also the Carolingians with the empire, or the same French monarchy and its absolutism and the sacralization of its monarchy dates straight back to Clovis. Something that, historiographically speaking, has been said, oh, it's not really true, we cannot speak of a continuity between the Merovingians, the Carolingians, the Capetians, it's really too much. No, it's exactly like that. And these people, why? Because these people believed it blindly, and it was what the entire political game of the land revolved around, right? The Merovingians were the only ones that took essentially the infants of their own dynasty and broke their heads against rocks, because they were taking out their nephews, etc., to avoid competitors, to avoid the fact that that blood that was sacred could live on in somebody that could essentially fragment the power. Because the other dreadful thing, of course, was that at being from a superior stock, but this was true for many other freemen in their own scale, all the sons had to inherit. So the entire kingdom was split, famously enough. I mean, the Merovingians are basically like a meme of this thing, right? That every generation they broke into four. It's historically correct to say that by the end of the 7th century there was no such thing like a Frankish kingdom, but there were four, right? The four sub-kingdoms that always clashed against each other. This was also great part of the dissolution of Merovingian power. But if you think of what the Carolingians did when they rose to power, that were already basically in charge, but they still kept these puppets at that point. The Merovingians were not really the roi fainéant that the historiography has depicted them like. The only ineffectual Merovingian kings were just the last ones, right? I don't know, Chilperic III, the last one, was seemingly just a random guy that had been put there to be fake Merovingian, just to continue the farce of that guy being some sort of divine thing, right, that would confer the legitimization by political institutional tradition to the same Franks as the Carolingians, at that point, the Pippinids-Arnulfings, as masters of palace to rule, right? It had the Pope had to step in, as you know, to basically allow, as a superior spiritual authority, the Carolingian succession and the end of the Merovingian rule. With the holy anointing, with the sacralization that had started since the very beginning. I made a video about also the sacralization of the Merovingian monarchy, cross rising in blood, which is quite exemplificative, not just of the sacralization of the family, but also of the hematophilia and of the literal obsession of the Merovingians for blood. And I mean, consider the Franks. The popes lamented that already still at the beginning of the 7th century, the Franks that were formally, namely Christian, still made human sacrifice. I mean, that was actually a deeply important thing. I mean, of course, sacrifice in the sense that these were just, the savages, making ooga around at the fire, burning people. They were actually, these were probably prisoners of war, something that were massacred ritually in some fashion, right? And the Franks insisted very much on this, also from an ideological point of view, because that was still tributed in this still hybrid pagan Christian spirituality as properly the proof, the fulfillment of their own superiority as a people too, because still through the Merovingians, the Franks assumed this greater superiority. I mean, even the massacre at Verdun, right, when the Saxons were beheaded, we don't really have much of a proof of that, if not the same Carolingian propaganda. I mean, it's funny how people today are completely dumb. They're just looking at who kills more people and, in history to go against them, and not even understanding why people do certain things. I mean, people's lives, you can even think they have the same value, but actions do not have the same value. It's not by counting more or less that you actually achieve what you're pretending to morally. You have to contextualize the Franks. The Carolingians were the first ones who needed to boast a bloody massacre of thousands of Saxons that probably didn't even take place in that scale that the sources tell, because they had to show the world what happened in a deterrent fashion to bring order in this enormous thing that had built and that the Saxons had resisted against, and losing also in a bad way, but at least kind of a successful one for the further development of Saint Saxons. The empire restarted from there in the 10th century. It's a completely different thing. In any case, this is the kind of mindset that one has to have sculpted in his own mind in turn when starting to think anything even minimal about the Franks. If one doesn't understand the Frankish warlikeness and obsession for blood, and this radical belief in the fact that the Franks believed, just like the Jews and the Romans, that they were the chosen people, right? These are the three peoples in history literally believed they were. And this is what gave them the moral force that we know to achieve what they did. The Franks were literally obsessed with this. They also thought of the Translatio Imperii that had been a Roman Empire. Now the Imperium had shifted into the hands of the Franks, that God had wanted that. So, as we've seen also in the history of religion videos, it doesn't even make sense to differentiate between paganism and Christianity, especially in the Frankish world, because frankly, and literally, that's the best adverb you can use. They didn't pose themselves even the problem. It was literally the same thing, right? And also, it's needless to say that the Carolingians were kind of more Jewish, influence than Christian influence, as they were radically obsessed, exactly because of their bloodthirst, with the many incredibly violent and military nature of the Old Testament and of the Lord, God, Lord of battles, and that fought alongside them, right? And if you really want to start to study some of the most important sources of military history, study the Bible, because without that also you can't really go very far in the first place historically, not just religiously speaking, but this was the attitude, right? What happened from a more material point of view that is still more important, as we were saying in the beginning, is that by the time of the rise of the Pippinid-Arnulfings, that, as you know, took a while before rising, right? They were already, important in the 7th century, and as you know, they took over finally by the mid-8th, right? So it was a very gradual thing. It was this rise from the bottom up, fundamentally, of these chieftains / lords at this point that managed to acquire private fortune, then making this career as master of palace, fighting against the other masters, this dramatically fragmented reality, being schooled in the art of war in the bloody Saxon frontier, because those Saxons every once in a while raided the Rhineland, and the Franks had to go there raiding Saxony, that way before Charlemagne, right? That was the standard. Also, that's why as soon as the Franks said, okay, let's cut it all out, and that's how they waged 30 years of war in Saxony until they stopped, right? They did stop, because they didn't try again, and they became actually the best Frankish offspring, you can argue. But the Frankish people, this is really important, was at that point a class of land owners. This is crucial. When you think about the Franks, you have to think about psychopathically bloodthirsty, self-exalted, individualistic warriorism, and a lot of land. But I mean a lot of land, where all the thing that they could wage war for came from. I mean, think about their their weapons, their armor, their war horses, right? You know that Gaul had, since pre-Roman times, at the time of the Celts, this kind of obsession for horses. Independently from eventually the type of cavalry was nurtured, because contrary to what is commonly believed, the Celts didn't really have much of a great cavalry, qualitatively speaking. It's just they had a lot. They had really a liking for them. And already Celtic world was kind of a proto-feudal society in some way, and the Romans reinforced that with the latifundium. And so, again, the Franks arrived and found this reality was already radically aristocratic and already kind of militarized, telling the truth, even in the ecclesiastical elite. And they simply superimposed their mental, their moral force, their moral strength acquired in the nightmarish barbaricum to use those means to their own end. And that's how the Merovingian Empire happened. And especially, let's say, by the time of the rise of the Pippinids-Arnulfings, you know the name, where it comes from Pippin of London and, you know, Arnulf of Metz. They married into each other, families they had. And also a beautiful example of how a secular and an ecclesiastical lord, which is also another feature eventually of medieval Europe, that stemmed in great part from the same Frankish world, emerged, right? At this time, this Frankish world was mostly like a Frankish-Burgundian one, right? This is often overlooked, that the Burgundian, you know, the Burgundians weren't much of a power during the migration era. They were in fact brought under, right? The same areas that inhabited were the Romans deported them, because they were after they had been crashed on the Middle Rhine. But they were established there and kind of remained there, and they kind of preserved themselves. The Alemanni were stronger, for example, but they were eventually brought down by the Franks. They paid in blood. They had to retreat on the Alps, seeking for Theodoric's patronage, etc. Even though they all maintain, as we were saying before, this kind of ethnic base, which, again, mostly at that point bought into the Frankish model, also oligarchically speaking. Surely the Alemanni were also... You see, the Franks and the Alemanni, even just as ethnonyms, you know, that were confederal names. Actually, there were many different tribes. The Franks, especially from the areas where, you know, the protagonists of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest had stemmed. And means simply different thing. About the Franks we don't really know, but still has to do something with their egalitarianism, because Frank free, yeah, but it's being contested as well. But the Alemanni especially, it means all the men, right? So that kind of egalitarianism we're saying before. Well, the Alemanni settled in Romanized areas like the Agri Decumates, but they weren't as hierarchized probably as like the Franks. At least when they were defeated by them, eventually the Franks established themselves in Gaul, and so they osmotically oligarchized also Alemannia a little bit. Even though Alemannia maintained a bit of that taste, but for more kind of, you know, warlikeness at the lower level, right? Where the Franks were nurturing this massive lordly military clienteles, already Merovingian times, right? It's true that the heavy cavalry, as we know, it was great part revived. The heavily armored cavalry, that we know from emerging from the faction war, was nurtured especially from the times of Charles Martel onward, right? Because it was the time which he recovered great part of the unity of this empire, and he confiscated the lands of many bishops that were not just the little, priest, literally, taking care of his courtyard and, with little plants, etc. And this terrible Austrasian knights arrived and destroyed everything. Wow, no, actually these bishops were, severe motherfuckers with their own military retinues and kind of the local mobsters, and exercising a massive power. And they had essentially usurped what was considered, as we were saying before, royal property, with a great degree of arrogance from the side of Saint Caroline, of Merovingians, meaning that, that was namely Merovingian, but of course these noblemen had been ruling there from quite before, and they kind of continued to be there even when, namely being obeying to the Merovingians, right? And when the Merovingians had started killing each other and the whole freaking thing disintegrated, these people had gained ever more power also on lands that, yes, namely belonged to the king, right? And so the Carolingians substituted to that. We are the new kings now, and we need those lands. And so in fact there is a terrible press, even though at this time not quite such thing, but from the ecclesiastical side, the 8th century chronicles against Charles Martel. I mean, the Gallic episcopate couldn't really see the guy because he had confiscated mostly this land, this ecclesiastical land, right, to remunerate his military retinues with that land. And all this in spite of the victory of Poitiers over the Muslims and so on. So consider the importance of the land, right? So it's obvious here that we're talking of a completely Gallo-Roman German reality, because again, we're talking not even about the Franks anymore, but the Franks, the Burgundians, that had kind of blended more together in the area. In fact, what we consider to be France, because Burgundy also was, as you know, quite an advanced land in many ways. So the Burgundians had lost much of their political cohesion, but they were still rich, and so that blended well also with the Neustria in the north, whereas the lands in the east, in Austrasia, also Alemannia, etc., were kind of a bit wilder, right? It would take a while before, because they were less Romanized, right? And naturally, yeah, the Franks, the Burgundians, as stalks, had socially confused with the landowners of Latin ancestry, and it's kind of obvious. I mean, in Gaul, they even in Neustria, they spoke essentially Romance, right? At the court, it is true that they actually spoke Germanic up to probably the 10th century, but it was kind of, because there was this divide, it was still the idea that the rulers were the Germans and the rest of the Romance population were kind of under, right? And this was evident, especially because of that social divide. Because again, this difference, for example, didn't exist in Longobards Italy. Why? Because they're the land, or in Anglo-Saxon, because it didn't make sense. Like, both the German settlers and the Romance populations basically share the same amount of wealth. In Gaul, it was not like that, because the ruling class really, as we were saying before, were a very few people that owned an enormous amount of land and other people. So the latter people were considered lesser people. And so this is also in Nucha, the mentality of feudalism, and of this also ancestral beliefs that the superior stock had come to rule the weaker chthonic masses, right? The Franks were the angels of God that really waged his wrath against the superbs, the usurpers, and all these things, and all the rest had to obey and work for them in their military aristocratic lifestyle. Right? This was the mentality. Doesn't matter that maybe at that point, as the same, what were the origins of these people, nobody knows. They were, of course, of Roman ancestry in some part as well, pre-Germanic ancestry, but as a ruling class, as a model, still they maintained, in a way, that even the Germanic language was kind of, the one of the rulers, right? And this was, of course, even in Austrasia, it was essentially a Germanic area, whereas Neustria was a Romance area. But again, the majority of people were Romance. Latin was the language of culture, so at the end of the day, these people, even just to rule the land, were essentially Romanized. They wrote in Latin, they issued their laws in Latin, whatever. Especially in the south, then in the north it was different. In the north it was more like the oral tradition. But of course, with something that had to resemble more of a state, which was complicated to create there, but because it was based on this private military clienteles, essentially, and the landowning. So it was really based on force rather than some kind of more civilized administrative structure. But gradually would, of course, take over the Romance, even among the ruling classes. I mean, that's where you have the kingdom of Western Franks in the early 13th century becoming the Royaume de France. In any case, it took a long time And the importance of the land was ever more evident, especially in the 8th century, because in the 8th century, and we can see it for other peoples at this time, was, as you know, a demographic and economical revival of Europe. What we call the Dark Ages lasted a very, very, very few time, like 1 century and a half. Basically. From the 8th century, we have already this great revival that naturally increased also the socio-economical transactions, even monetary economy, which was originally very, as we'll see now, so kind of rare, right? This mostly during the Carolingian Empire. But in general, the need for a better regulation of wealth, especially based for the increasing need of military service for expanding Carolingian power that fueled itself, because the people who participated were remunerated with lands, with slaves, etc. Needed to regularize, but to homogenize better the recruitment issue. And we find it also among other peoples. Of course, the system was quite simple. Had been always the same. We had in the Romano-Germanic, also it was true among the Germans, among the Romans. I mean, depending on how much wealth you owned, you had to serve with a certain amount of equipment and for a certain amount of time. So, of course, as we were saying before, the reason why the Carolingians developed this professional heavy cavalry, because that's also properly the point. It's not even about the equipment. Like, we don't have any evidence of the fact that the Carolingians had any better hardware than, say, I don't know, the Visigoths, or actually they had. I mean, in relative terms, the best weapons came from the Frankish Rhineland. They were exported everywhere. But I mean, the typology was basically the same of any other people. What really made the difference in the Carolingian War was, again, the wealth that individuals owned, and that's what Carolingian armies came to be about. This core of professional heavy cavalry. It was professional because essentially they spent the entire life on horseback. Like every freaking year, they went to war, and it was their entire life. In fact, what is paradoxical, that in Frankish chronicles, they stopped even saying that there were military campaigns. They just noted the year in which there was not a military campaign, because that was actually the big news. For the rest, waging war was absolutely normal. And as you know, the Franks had lots of peoples around against waging war. The Arabs, the Bretons, the Frisians, the Saxons, the Bavarians, the Longobards, etc., the Avars, and so it was always hammering down rebellions, revolts, keeping these peoples under, taking tributes, pillaging, deporting people, and so on. And so this was effectively how the empire had formed, and the core was about these heavily armored horsemen that might, especially at the beginning, this is true during especially Charlemagne's reign, that in order to counter the already well-established nobility, very often the king would rise even serfs to the rank of freemen. This was part of the Vassalatic-Beneficiary deal, that when where there was the mixtio manum, the sworn oath on the Bible, etc., you became free, but still kind of under that lord, which was always a personal bond. Right, it's like the mafia again. You become that guy's guy, right? And it's a very demanding contract for the both of them, because you have to go to war and be ready to die, right? In the best Germanic comitatus loyalty form. We will talk now about the Antrusiones. But the Lord had to provide for you land, promotion, right, and protection. And so this was at mutual benefit, as you understand. The Carolingian Empire broke down essentially when it had overexpanded, and therefore they didn't know what to do to carry out the same lifestyle, if not within their own land. This is basically the only way why the Carolingian Empire collapsed, but also basically the reason why it couldn't but collapse by some certain degree. Not external enemies, etc. Those were just a consequence of the internal disgregation. I think we made enough videos about that. In any case, it was a formidable military machine. There were still lots of infantrymen. In fact, if you look at them, of course, were the majority. They would always remain in Western Europe, such as not much of a surprise. But these guys were like, yeah, there was basically also the equivalence of that professional trooper on foot, also because, frankly, drawing too much categorically the difference between horsemen and infantrymen at this point doesn't even make sense, especially among the nobility. Still, at this point, cavalry was already superior in qualitative terms, but infantry could challenge cavalry. I mean, think about the Zundtelt, which is one of the few Carolingian defeats at the hands of the Saxons, by the way. Well, that proved that infantry could still win over cavalry. It's not before the mid-12th century you can't claim kind of a mounted hegemony on the battlefields. That also would last just for another, essentially for another 150 years, right? So we don't have to focus on the type of arm either, but on the fact that they were ever more professional. Then there were lots of other freemen that were called to arms. There were the rota systems. I mean, that's why I made also a Carolingian army organization video, and we'll keep talking about that. There are huge historiographical debates on how large these armies were, but it's not much of a, very important, right? What is extraordinary about the Franks is their logistics. They had a massive organization with enormous stocks scattered all over the empire, with the main connected to the main roads, etc. And this would influence even just the rights. Think about the Fodrum, medieval times, really the right that the king, the emperor, retained for literally for feeding the horses when he passed with his troops, with his retinues across the land, and was terrifying. If you look especially the invasion of Italy across the Alps with a pincer movement with tens of thousands of men, it was a massive, but I mean a massive logistical endeavor. And even the 9-month siege of the Longobarд capital Pavia, I mean, nobody besieged cities at the time. The Carolingians managed to do it for 9 freaking months. That tells you how overwhelmingly loaded in resources Central Europe was already at the time, how much the Carolingian control on them worked effectively, right, to carry out that thing. It was probably the single most impressive feature of the Carolingian military. And we will make videos literally about single examples of also the distances they covered, thousands of kilometers all across continental Europe. Was impressive. I mean, logistically, even the attack at the Avar Khaganate, it was destroyed. It was all across the Danube from water to from land. Terrifying. It was something the Franks were really like a major power, like Europe had never seen from centuries. And so the land here was crucial, because you understand that in order to squeeze all those resources, you had to have a control properly on the population. We have something similar. We made a video, for example, about the Longobards military organization that shows something that was basically identical in the Carolingian world. Or the only thing that changed, again, was the type of wealth distribution. The Longobards, like basically no other people in Western Europe, unlike the Carolingians, were the exception, had a large enough core of professional troops to field, right? That's why the Franks could effectively steamroll anybody around them, because again, they had a core that was literally professional, like unlike any other could afford, right? All the other peoples relied on much less amount of land individually. So maybe they had even kind of a better cohesion at an infantry level or something in a communitarian sense, but in terms of aptitude to arms, nobody could beat the elite of the Frankish army. It was comforted also by this other rest of massive auxiliary troops and logistical resources, also because they were smaller countries, right? I mean, pick the Carolingian Empire compared to essentially Lombard and Tuscany. It's just, the entire Longobards kingdom was like one Teilreich of the Frankish Empire by comparison, right? So these things do weight. It's, as you know, I am not a fan of historical materialism, but the size here did matter. And in the Longobard army, there was under King Heistulf, a military legislation that basically showed how formally the figure of the people army in the best Romano-Germanic tradition resisted, because all in this laws, the Arimanni were asked for military service on the basis of their possessions, service on horseback, on foot, depending on the size of their assets, right? And not much had really changed over the centuries. Again, the main changes have to be observed in the contingent political and social reality of the time. After all, the forms of recruitment were the same. Were connected to the land, to the mansi. It's interesting because also the language of the standard land plot was kind of the same among the Franks, the Longobards, etc. However, this was coming traditionally together with an important anthropological transformation of this world that we don't have the time today to digress entirely on. I promise we will make other videos about this. Also from the perspective of history of religion, it's actually the transition from, the tribal world to feudalism in many ways. And as we were saying before, even just, through some religious indicators, and this is also evident from what we know about the churches of the Merovingian Empire across the land, where the same priests didn't know how to read Latin. I mean, things like they didn't understand the Bible even, and there were still human sacrifices beginning of the 7th century. This Central European work took an awful lot to properly even to just Christianize, to kind of pacify, to stabilize, right? We see, for example, the Alemanni, we are lucky of the fact that they Christianized like 1 century later compared to the Franks and the Longobards. Already, for example, by the 8th century, didn't bury together with weapons anymore. The Alemanni still did, right? There were enough resources to make war, but not really to accelerate too much these changes in many ways, because the two things were connected. The Franks had a vocation for war and loot, there is no doubt, and at the same time, when the world stabilizes, becomes like a proper kingdom, that there are these civil wars, etc., but at the same time there is kind of also an order. There's also a crisis that brings normally also kind of a further advancement in administration, in savings, all these things. If you see the campaigns at the time of Clovis, you see this essentially how it could be in antiquity. These armies of 30,000 men, very well served, armed, supplied. By the end of the 6th century, you look at the civil wars among the Merovingians. I mean, literally, these were like hunting parties. There were lots of battles, but there were small parties, and the resources of Europe by the 6th century had dramatically contracted. Again, we don't know why, whether it was war itself that destroyed, because that's a very important aspect of what is agricultural systems at the time were incredibly fragile, and also the plague and all this stuff. But in general, also the world grows and ages in a way and gets somewhat wiser. So this is exactly the point. It's paradoxical that from a dynastic point of view, the Merovingians kept killing each other bloodily with feuds among brothers, etc., and relatives that would never end between these 4 kingdoms. They're all bordered at a corner where they made all the worst mess. But they had not been able, and this also what their decline ideologically in front of the people had substantiated itself of, had not been able, not showed at least, to be able to lead their people in offensive wars of large immediate profit. I mean, it's it. I mean, from the conquests in southern Gaul against, Aquitaine, stripped from the Visigoths, some intervention in also in Italy in alliance with the Byzantines against the Longobards, etc. Some the countering of the Avars in Germany, up to essentially the victories of Charles Martel against the Arabs, etc. the Merovingians do not wage war anymore. They just fight each other, right? The reason, of course, the various local lords were able to maintain control, to maybe raid on the neighbors, but it was like a small thing. So a lot had changed in this regard. And it had changed, as we were saying before, in order to explain the enormous Carolingian military organization into something definitely more advanced. Something that has to do also with the connection between the Frankish church and the Roman one that by far predates the Carolingian bond. It was already a Merovingian thing. It was, also with this contraction, economical, demographical, people mentally, also the freemen, had kind of lost their attitude to war in the same way as before. They accepted a bit more the established order. They kind of gentrified. That's obvious. What the Germans had settled in Gaul, they had just become locals. They had been habituated to a more civil life. They had softened up like everybody. That's where they had migrated there for in the first place. They wanted the richer lands, and there was naturally still in these primitive islands of the vast Merovingian empire, a persistent warlike vocation in minorities of people. And this one had contributed to channel itself in the armed clienteles of the powerful lords that essentially imitated the royal retinue, the so-called trustees, which literally means, like it counts for saying etymology of trust, of trustees. That is, as we've seen, we made many videos about the Germanic comitatus, was a general tradition already in those fragmented tribal realities well before that the Germanic peoples would reverse into the Roman Empire. And that's in fact how this enormous Central and Western European world was ruled like. There was a lord of the land that was could be the Frankish count, the Frankish, like the local bishop, let's say, or both of them, that maybe had married into each other's families, and that they shared power. The bishop mostly in the city, the Frankish lord mostly in the country, but that's also kind of too much of a categorization. But they were essentially landlords, and they had come to imitate each other's customs, because the bishops, the Gala Roman bishops of senatorial ancestry, were the ones that had, for example, a written culture, an administration. They had also some degree of international relations in this, the church, etc., and they had kind of taught the Frankish chieftains also how to administrate their land with their advisors. They had, brought them within also justice, as it was, rudimentarily exercised on the base, now some documentary, and not just on the oral tradition of, judicial duel, but at the same time, in fact, the Frankish chieftains had militarized the bishops. The bishops had started to live more like secular lords, to share this aristocratic, military, proto-chivalric ethos. Because they were in charge of the local populace, they were powerful. They had guards that followed them, and they participated to political intrigues, and in the clash among the Merovingians, they had to fight against the brigands. And so basically there had been an homogenization in the means of rule, and this means of rule here were fundamentally owning a lot of people and a lot of land, and therefore military retinues that were ever more kind of professionally oriented. And again, the social divide was enormous, because nobody had really brought down the Roman latifundium there. The social divide had remained. And so that's where the feudal world, in a sense, originated from. But it would be better understood as if we started to think of the Roman world, and also of the pre-Roman world by a certain degree, in a feudal sense, right? Erasing the idea of democracy or republicanism that never existed among these people by any stretch of the imagination. Only the stronger ruled. This was at the root of the Roman Empire, was the root of the Germanic people. It was the same thing, it was shared. And so the political military virtue of the Pippinids was in attracting around their own, capacity, their own dynamism and ambition and aggressiveness and achievements in the wars of Austrasia within the Frankish world and against the external threats, as we were saying before, that were always looming, growing clienteles contingents. This was obvious. The more powerful you became in terms of crushing your own political enemies and seizing their land, their chattel, their people, the people that would work for you in turn, the more you could retribute your own military clienteles that would become stronger, more cohesive, more faithful, more loyal, because they knew that betting on you was very convenient, and so you would become more powerful and crush that other guy and that other guy, and that's how fundamentally the Carolingians came to power. Very slowly, because again, this thing could really be reversed at every moment, politically, militarily, right? There were many setbacks. It's an incredibly complicated history, by the way. At some point, we'll hopefully look at it in detail. It's very overlooked, but also very beautiful. There were always enemies, as we're saying right now, the Saxons ravaging the Rhineland, and how many times the Carolingians that essentially stemmed from the area around Cologne, at least as a comital power, they had to curb, and the Saxons were not really tender-hearted people, or not very soft ones. So we're talking about, in fact, some of the single most violently brutal and ruthless and merciless theaters in the entire early medieval history. The Saxons and the Franks had knocked out the Thuringians together, for that matter, and it's just the fact that they're less documented actually should tell you how much more brutal and primitive that reality was, rather than taking it like, oh, nothing really, happened there, which it might have been true. They were just frontier warfare, nothing, but the brutality for those who participated into them was quite evident. And there is, especially about the political military virtue of the Pippinids-Arnulfings, the distinct perception that this family emerged from a military and cultural context that, being in fact more militarized, more primitive, and kind of more traditional in a Germanic sense, was also kind of stronger and more driven and more kind of clear-minded in that sense than the Gala Roman reality was. That is to say, something that had softened up, had kind of corrupted itself, had fallen apart, because that's fundamentally what happened to the Frankish kingdom. And so the idea that this other wave of this new other people, like it had been with the decline of the Roman Empire, the same decline of the Merovingian Empire, now from the east again, later on the same Saxons would become those who renewed the empire. You see always the more primitive warlike people that comes with a new shot of strength, and then kind of softens again, revived the Frankish Empire. In fact, that's the Carolingian one that we remember, and the substitution of the ruling dynasty accordingly. And so these clienteles were recruited also naturally within the aristocracy, because again, it was a matter of who was stronger and who could offer this better contract, right? The aristocracy was provided of armored retinues on its own. So that's how the empire was factually built, privately. As we've seen for the Carolingians, this started first of all in Austrasia, because the Austrasians there were also those who came further in power. Again, those were re-injected also, that Germanic element, probably also in the court. That's why it lived longer, up to the 10th century, in a Romance land like because definitely you could not share the cake with those who owned the cake already, right? You had to conquer the cake, and that's, as we were saying before, the Carolingians carried out this systematic reconquest, and with all the annexed violence and, essentially taking out of the political opponents to reunite the empire under their control. And it's not that the system was intrinsically different from the one of the Merovingians. In fact, it should be fair to say that literally everything that the Carolingians did, except being crowned by the Pope as emperors, was Merovingian. Right? The Carolingians had a great propaganda system that historiographically made us think of the Merovingians as they sucked, but basically they were the same thing. Like the entire traditional, the ideological emphasis on the dynasty, on that sacralization, on blood, etc., it was all Merovingian. The Carolingians were factually just a continuation of the same Merovingian power. And so that disgraceful measure also of dividing the empire every time among male sons, etc., was a problem for the Carolingians too. And if, in all honesty, if we admire and witness a Carolingian empire, it's just because Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, that by the way were possibly also for those reasons now basically the only enlightened Carolingian rulers really, had remained without brothers in a way or another. If Charlemagne had not died, we might have not had a Carolingian empire with Charlemagne just ruling. We would remember still this kind of divisions between this new dynasty that had emerged, but Charlemagne would have not had the possibility of being Charlemagne in the way we would remember Carloman and Charles. That's it, right? And instead, Carloman died, and so that allowed all a serious thing, the conquest of Italy, the expansion of the Arab border. So things that literally changed the whole freaking game. The same Renovatio Imperi, the Carolingian, but there would have been other powers around that the Carolingians would have not taken out. The entire history of Europe would have been different. And we're talking just about, in fact, a dynastic tie. And that's how important, in fact, it confirms itself to be within the Frankish rule. So as we were saying, the Austrasians were the Franks that had remained kind of more traditional in nature. Austrasia was the region that had maintained more the large Germanic military footprint within the Merovingian area. It had stratified as well. I mean, Austrasia was not what it was like 200 years before in Charles Martel time. Let's say there this kind of vassalatic system had already spread as well. So even though the area was traditionally also providing with this kind of more militarized population, because the individual freemen were richer, right? But at the same time, the same Carolingian power was based on this ever more private and hierarchically organized lordly retinues, right? So the divide is relative, but the spirit is there. And in fact, even think about Charles Martel, right? We call him like this because it means Little Mars. And it is with this name that at the time they wanted to underline emphasize the particular military attitude of the master of palace, drawing, at least in this case, from the Roman pantheon, the traditional deity. But as you know, all these people share the same idea of the deity of war. And it's from Charles Martel, by the way, that we call them Carolingians and not Pippinid-Arnulfings, right? So not even from Charlemagne. Charles Martel did really change a big deal and started a series of mechanisms, including this properly reinvigoration of the military clientele mechanism of loot, reward, enfeoffment, etc., that would be at the base of what we see in the Carolingian world, in post-Carolingian world, and as a consequence also for basically Western Europe as a whole in the later centuries. So from Austrasia, the expansion naturally took the direction of the west. It's as if it had been a new migration, right? A new invasion in some sort. In Gaul, in the neighboring regions, these Germanic regions had been hegemonized more or less firmly by the Franks back in the day, but that had been escaping a bit the concentric force at the disgregation of Merovingian power, such as Alemannia, Bavaria. So these areas between the Rhine and the Danube. The Alemanni were, at this point, there was a massacre. At some point, their aristocracy was called by the Franks. They were essentially Frankish Alemannic in descent at that point, as aristocrats especially. They were literally all beheaded. There was a blood court were taken out by treachery by the Franks. Bavaria was, as you know, the far eastern, was not even a kingdom technically. It was known as a duchy. In fact, the Bavarians were not even properly a people. They were just a sort of, politically a sort of Frankish fabrication that had condensated this kind of German, Celtic, Roman, even partly Slavic populations that had blended together in this kind of power that had also gravitated around Lombard Italy at the same time. You know that since the 6th century, the Franks were the stronger, and they had more land from the side of the Alpine watershed that actually pertained to the Longobards in Italy. Instead, the Longobards had the same with Bavaria. They surpassed the Danubian, the Alpine watershed into the Danubian valley because they were more powerful. And Bavaria had always acted a bit like ambiguously with the Franks, mostly aligning themselves with the Longobards, trying to escape this Frankish control. But eventually, think about Tassilo, Charlemagne's cousin that also fought against him and eventually was brought down. So it's as if the Carolingians had given a new lymph, a new blood to the veins of this pre-existent, in fact, Merovingian Empire. I like to stress this aspect because, in my opinion, it was very deeply ingrained in Frankish mindset, as we were saying before, that as a chosen people, they were actually ruling as the Romans had done. Also because the Roman model was fundamentally still around as on the fore, internationally speaking, and that's proven also by the Carolingian revival of the same. But they properly saw themselves as emperors, right? They were a people, the Franks, ruling over other peoples, the Alemanni, the Bavarians, etc. And the consolidation of the frontiers was really important. Also, subduing these peoples once again meant fresh new retinues that were sent by these peoples, and especially between the Rhine and the Danube, the Alemanni, the Bavarians, they were still kind of warlike, and then the Carolingians picked some elite from there, as they did from the Longobards later on, as they did from the Bretons. I mean, the best was co-opted, and in fact, the Carolingian armies were somewhat multi-ethnic in this regard because they came from all the peoples of the empire. And this specific clienterly development around the Pippinids, integrating robustly with armed men that were so by vocation, just by lifestyle, the normal military forces of the people based on the bannum, on the interior, the levy of old freemen, as we were seeing before, that actually happened through a rota system, and this militia was becoming ever less effective, actually. However, allowed effective responses to the aggressions, because again, still, this world was under attack, right? We've seen the Arabs, we've seen still the Saxons, every people that was not stabilized at the frontier had to be stabilized, because maybe they were even just small race, but it stabilized the area. I mean, Saxony stabilized the Rhineland, was also a growing center of trade, etc. That therefore also increasingly attracted the Saxon race. That's why they obliterated Saxony. It was a powerful ideological but also quite concrete need, politically, strategically. And the system also fueled the same wars of conquest that at some point were, an expansion of power, the establishment of some sort of clientery relations also with other peoples, including the Western Slavs, for example, interfering even with faraway powers like the Bulgarian Empire, or arriving, in fact, in up to southern Italy, at the frontier with the Byzantines, right, which was a big deal, reactivated, in fact, this great historical and unavoidable enmity between the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire that would have actually already started, in fact, at the end of the Gothic War, when the Franks and the Alemanni launched some raids up to southern Italy that were eventually crushed by the Byzantines, if the Longobards had not acted as a wedge in between, but that, as you know, would reactivate in the antagonism between the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire when the Carolingians took over Italy. And that was crucial because there was Rome, there was all the imperial dignity that and it was an enormous change, and we made videos of this, and we'll keep making them because it's really, really important. In general, I mean, at the time of Charles Martel, the main deal was actually the eastern frontier. I mean, he's mostly famous, of course, for the Battle of Tours / Poitiers. That was a big deal of a battle in many ways, but it was kind of also episodic in part. Also, we know that the Arabs kept raiding southern France, and that's also an area where the Carolingians had in a decentralized position in the frontier, a relative control, and very often even the southern Gauls didn't like at all the Franks of the north, so they contributed to that paradoxically. But it's the East. In fact, recently I was making a video about the cruciality of the Magyar-Slavic frontier in the 10th century, so 2 centuries later, that would actually measure the solidity of Western Central Europe altogether in the centuries to come. Because it was a very complicated frontier with peoples like the Western Slavs, and eventually would have arrived first still in, before Charlemagne, they were still the Avars, by the way. Then the Magyars would arrive at the end of the 9th century. But it was difficult to control because it was not even properly a real frontier. Like, it was just an open, enormous amount of Central Eastern European land that had been a bit the same problem of the Romans, right? The first conquered Germany, then bailed out after Teutoburg. And it was always like a big question mark because the area was profitable by some standard, and there was these peoples that were kind of tumultuous and warlike and unstable, and they caused nervousness there. But what could you do there? In order to stabilize the team, you had to launch this massive series of campaigns and try to build a lot, fortresses, trying to deforest, trying to bring them under control. Like the Carolingians spent themselves enormously, as you know, with the Saxons that were already kind of, closer to the Franks. In fact, they weren't really very different from the Austrasians. And you know that the first campaigns against the Saxons were not worth it. But the Carolingians were so clear-minded about war that they knew that they would have had to stay there for generations to finally subdue them. And in fact, Saxony was a total and utter success of the Franks. But it was extremely costly in absolute terms. In relative terms, it was a great success. So that, traditionally speaking, in Gaul was the normality of things, trying to stabilize the eastern frontier, the areas of the Rhine, the Elbe, because creating that buffer area that would allow especially the Rhineland to prosper without raids was crucial. And however, as you know, the Carolingian Empire would kind of literally overflow. They would conquer the Spanish mark, south of the Pyrenees. They took over the Lombard kingdom. It was a massive asset, and that also from which the Franks benefited enormously in terms, not just because of the papal crowning and all the same thing, but let's say of all the cultural output that could help the creation of some kind of public administration. Think about even the creation of a copy of Rome in Aachen, in the north, was something really new. Like even just, I don't know, a stone palace was a big deal in Central Europe at the time. Eventually, the Carolingian Empire wouldn't survive, but still the connection between these areas of Europe would remain, till today, crucial. Right? What are we looking today at the European Union fundamentally like? It's still the central areas that the Carolingian one in practice, and so really an enormous legacy that it's really important, and the Carolingians maintain, in spite probably they didn't even realize what they did, because they were mostly concerned again about all the mythology of the Imperium, etc. Probably again, as we were saying before, Charlemagne and Louis the Pious thought in kind of longer terms, but nobody could really predict what would happen. And paradoxically, even though the empire collapsed, and it did completely, the Vassalatic social structures, the role of the church, the monastery, of literacy would maintain this extraordinary degree of homogeneity to make the West as we know it, which is utterly extraordinary from a historical point of view. And it would be exported to England with the Normans, and equally in southern Italy with the same, among the other peoples, also by osmosis with the Western Slavs, the Iberian Peninsula, Scandinavia. And it's all a massive work made literally out of blood, because that's what it was, but also just as a convincing model, because you don't win if you don't convince, really. That's the thing. Especially when others actually imitate your own model, just by firstly also changing and their own community with all the problems, because they realize it's the best way to improve, to become more powerful. And we can't even see a major planning of what this would be from a strictly strategical point of view. I mean, we will make a video about this, but the Carolingians would mostly intervene where it was needed, because basically every place needed some kind of control campaigns, putting down rebellions. There were some kind of great projects, of course. As we've seen, Saxony was probably intended to be that, if not since the very beginning, but at least intentionally, like getting rid of the problem at the root. There were other great ideas. There were of course, the Carolingian embassies to Baghdad to make a Carolingian embassy alliance against the Byzantines, things like these. But also those were contingent. It was just the world of the time. It was dramatically unpredictable and complicated. Not less than today's, but say with a much higher degree of instability altogether. It was the, in fact, clientelar expansion of the Pippinids Carolingians that was in turn imitated by the one of the clientelar nuclei that already operated around the powerful parental groups and the churches, by the way, because the churches had the same military retinues, as we were saying before, that were all clienteles now framed within the net of aristocratic alliances woven by the new dynasty to constitute the basic experience for all the further political military evolution of the Middle Ages. That was the Vassalatic tradition. And again, if you're interested, go watch that video on the Commendatio. I thought I could even remake it because it's very old. It's kind of a pain to listen, but it's important because, again, the concept of vassus, also the etymology is old, is Celtic. It has to do with this kind of servant, right? With this guy that almost even something between a servant errant knight, a devotee warrior, whatever, that is under the lord, under the king, right? And that was thus present in the pre-feudal world that had factually always been kind of a feudal world. But that in Carolingian times was dramatically intensified and basically politically and institutionally standardized in the Frankish world, in the Carolingian world, and in the post-Carolingian world, eventually to be exported, as we know, we call it the feudalism, in the rest of Europe and the Mediterranean and even beyond, frankly. And I like to say frankly when I make videos about the Franks. But these roots are crucial, because you understand that there is a fil rouge from the very beginning and before to the blossoming, to the development, to the affirmation of systems that marked basically our entire view of history, we could say, and still the world in which we live now. So for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.